essays in this book encompass the last 2 years, and center, or the impetus for it, was the attack on the World Trade Center in September of 2001, and my response to that, and then my increasing disenchantment with our war, so-called war on terrorism, about which I've been raising a number of questions for the last several months, because I don't really understand how it's possible to have a war on an unknown enemy and an abstract noun. I also thought that the attack on September 11th would engender a lively debate in not only the Congress but also in the American media about not only how did such a thing come to pass, but what is the nature of our response? What should we know that we didn't know? What kind of country do we wish to become? And do we spend more of our treasure on our own, improving our own lot, that is to say, our own infrastructure, our health and environment and so forth? Or do we go searching abroad for monsters to destroy? That is a phrase of John Adams, whose recommendation to the new American Republic in the early 19th century recommended that we do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And then, having written a number of these essays over the course of the last 12 or 13 months, I found myself trying to write an introduction that would fill in the backstory, because or what I think is the backstory, because my attitude and my opinion and my approach to the current war on terrorism follow from my reading of American foreign policy over the last 50 years, since the end of World War II. My sense of the last 50-odd years is that we as a nation, the United States, have squandered much of its fortune. In 1945, we are the unquestioned supreme power in the world. There is our economic and military supremacy is self-evident. China is in the middle of a civil war. Japan is in ruins. So is Western Europe. So is much of Asia. And here's the United States, untouched in its own continent by World War II, triumphant. Not only do we have a supreme military and economic power, we also have, at least I think we have, at that point in time, an enormous fortune measured as moral and intellectual force. The best of the American ideas that we inherit from the Constitution seem to be in shining force. Americans were welcomed in Europe, everywhere in the world, as saviors, as people of immense goodwill and generosity of spirit, who embodied the ideas toward which the world could work. And then we put into practice the Marshall Plan, which was a further expression of that spirit. And then it seems to me that although we still maintain the economic and military supremacy, we have lost much of our intellectual and moral force over a over the last 50 years, and during a succession of different presidencies. I mean, I'm making no distinction here really between Democrat and Republican. I find this sense of decline not only in the Nixon administration, but also in the Reagan administration and in the Clinton administration and now in the Bush administration. So it's not a partisan observation. And I therefore think that there are reasons to go back to September 11th. I think that we should not have been entirely surprised by the attack on the trade towers because of some of our actions over the last 50 years. And I also think that our response, as I've seen in the last year, encapsulates the whole of the preceding 50 years. In other words, I think that in miniature, we have, between September 2001 and this month, a encapsulation of the preceding 50 years. And that is the context of the essays in this book. I think that the squandering of the fortune is a result of, well, I use the trope of the United States in 1945 as heir, the spendthrift heir. I mean, we inherit the earth. Europe has attempted suicide twice in the 20th century, and we find Americans suddenly proconsuls in Europe. We find them telling the Japanese emperor that he is no longer a god, and we take over the British positions in the oil holdings in the Middle East. And we are all things to all people. We are supplying grain, machinery, ideas, and so on. And over time, we also think we can afford anything. As Kennedy says in 1960, there is no price that we won't pay. There is nothing too small, no war we won't fight, no principle we won't defend, and so forth. And over time, I think we develop a kind of fanciful notion. We get this dream, this romance of imperial power, that we can write all the scripts in the world, and we are the principal player, and everybody else has a secondary role. And it's as if Washington becomes a vast movie studio where we are deciding which dictator to support and when, and who is good and who is bad, and so on. It's a simplification, but I think it's generally true, and we now see that playing out in the Bush doctrine announced last week of the preemptive strike, forward deterrence, anticipatory self-defense, is setting up the United States really on the lines of a supreme empire. We will tell the world what to do. We will decide who is an enemy and attack them accordingly, and couple that kind of policy with a statement that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld made last June to a press conference in Brussels. He'd come out of a meeting at NATO. He's being questioned by European reporters as to the progress of the war on terrorism and what evidence does the United States have that that war is going well, and where is Osama bin Laden, and what other operations do we intend in the Philippines or in Somalia, and so forth. And Rumsfeld says to the reporters, he says, I don't need to tell you what is happening because, and now I'm quoting directly, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And that sort of position is, to me, a very frightening one, because that I also can see the same assumptions implicit in the USA Patriot Act, which was passed in October within 6 weeks of the attack on the Trade Center last year, put forward by John Ashcroft at the Attorney General's office, and passed with only a few hours of debate by both houses of Congress. And I have read that fairly carefully, and I've had it explained to me by constitutional lawyers who make sense of it. And it means that the government can open anybody's mail, tap anybody's phone, search anybody's premises without a warrant. It severely damages or erodes many of the constitutional rights implicit in the Bill of Rights. And we have had also within the last year 2 reorganizations of the FBI, which further extend the government's police power and allow criminal investigations of actions that may or may not be criminal, and rely on the same kind of thinking that shows up in Rumsfeld's remark about the absence of evidence not being evidence of absence. So I think we've come to a crossroads in this country. I mean, we at this point in time really can ask ourselves, what kind of country do we mean to have? What are our principles? Can we attack in Iraq in the same way, let us say, that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor? I mean, you read the statements coming out of the Pentagon being leaked to the press over the last few months, and it sounds like they mean to stage something grand and imperial in the Japanese manner, or something with 300,000 or 400,000 troops, or something subtle with parachutes, and that might look like the Normandy invasion that staged by the greatest generation. And it's as if they're playing with movie scripts. And I don't, a country that suddenly has to hold Senate hearings to ask itself whether it has a reason to go to war, in my opinion, doesn't have a reason to go to war, because that it's the kind of question that likely to be asked by people who don't really know what war means. And it is that dreaming sense of omnipotence that has, I think, had a deteriorating effect on American foreign policy over the last 50 years. So when I hear last January, I listened to Bush at the State of the Union address pronounce the sentence of doom on Saddam Hussein, and I think that he's attacking a target of rhetorical convenience. The war on terrorism wasn't going very well at the time. There were bombs going off every few days on a bus in Israel. Osama bin Laden hadn't been found, and neither had Mullah Omar. And who more convenient to attack than Hussein. At least we could find Hussein. We knew where he was. And he was clearly a villain. We know that about him. We also know him quite a lot better than you would guess, I think, by reading most of the mainstream media. The CIA staged a coup d'etat in Iraq in 1963, and then again in 1968, and those two coups d'etat brought Hussein to power. He was our candidate. We brought him to power the same way we brought Noriega to power in Panama, and the Shah of Iran in Tehran. And then, if you will remember, we also backed Hussein very strongly during the long war of the 1980s between Iraq and Iran. We supplied Iraq with chemical weapons and also with military advisors to instruct the Iraqis how to point and use those chemical weapons. And at the time that was happening, the Washington Post was writing editorials and suppressing the objection to our patronage of Hussein, and the editorials would say, well, what difference does it make whether the weapons are chemical or not? I mean, the object is to kill Iranians, and how you kill them doesn't really matter. That's the Washington Post circa 1986. Now, of course, chemical weapons are seen as somehow monstrous, and so it depends from what perspective you are looking at the chemical weapons. It also reminds me that Bush has been talking about regime change, and we're not very good at regime change. We didn't manage to do that very successfully in South Vietnam. It took 12 years. It's the longest war ever fought by the United States. And we didn't manage to do it in Iraq. We didn't manage to do it in Iran. We didn't manage to do it very well in Chile, even though it resulted in the murder with our complicity of Allende. And we didn't do it very well in Afghanistan. In 1979, in the last year of the Carter administration, there was a secular government in power in Afghanistan that had, as part of its program, the freedom of women, to bring women out of those terrible hoods that they live under, and to a strong feminist rights program, a strong program to rid the country of the drug traffic, and also a program of agricultural reform. But this government was allied with the Soviet Union in terms of foreign policy. It was a government that was socialist in character and looked to the Soviet Union as its ally. And we thought, well, here's a chance to, we were still playing the great game of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was then the National Security advisor, director for the Carter administration, thought it might be a wonderful chance to embarrass and humiliate the Soviet Union by presenting them with a Vietnam-like quagmire in Afghanistan. So the United States, the CIA again, actively recruits the Mujahideen, which are the most fanatic, zealous Islamic fundamentalists. And we helped round them up from Saudi Arabia, and Syria, and Afghanistan. We helped train among the people that arrived, willing to take up the cause of holy jihad directed at the Soviet Union, was Osama bin Laden, who was one of the people that was trained, at least to some degree, by our own CIA. And he was a very romantic figure in 1984-85. There's an interview, which you can look up in the archive, with Dan Rather talking to Osama bin Laden in a cave somewhere in Afghanistan, and he's being presented to the American television audience as a romantic bandit who truly, you know, a wonderful fellow against the monstrous, godless communism. So, again, this is the kind of thing that we have been playing with over the last 50 years, and there never seems to be, until now, there hasn't seemed to be much of a consequence. If you remember our attempt at regime change in Cuba in 1961, the invasion at the Bay of Pigs, otherwise known as the Glorious March to Havana, and it looked very beautiful on the map overlays in Washington. And it was an utterly harebrained operation. The Cuban exiles went ashore with bad information, none of the weapons that we had promised them. The joyful Cuban peasants who were supposed to rise and begin to sing songs of happy liberation did not do that. We're now, of course, I mean, some of our people in the Pentagon are now expecting the same kind of thing in Baghdad. I would be very skeptical of that expectation. And so on exactly the same, this doomed expedition goes ashore, and oh yeah, the CIA also said there was no road in Cuba with which Castro could reinforce the Bay of Pigs from Havana. There was no road from Havana, according to our CIA. And of course, there was not only a road, it was a brand new road, and it was 4 lanes wide, and the tanks arrived within a matter of hours. And with Castro himself directing the fire. And at precisely that same hour, we have John F. Kennedy in the White House, white tie and tails, dancing to the music of a tune called Mr. Wonderful. And Kennedy has just sold out. 20 minutes before he goes onto the dance floor, he has just canceled his own promise to the Cuban exiles of American air cover from American carriers. I can go through these kinds of sequences, but they're in my head when I listen to Bush start pronouncing the sentence of doom on Hussein, and I think it's got to be rhetoric. The administration cannot be that stupid that essentially to attack the last 4 paragraphs in one of the Pentagon's apocalyptic briefing papers. And I remained fairly comfortable with that assumption through last spring. Bush would pop out of golf carts in Massachusetts and in Texas and demand regime change. The Pentagon leaked various sets of plans, sketches, scenarios for the invasion of Iraq. And then the first set of hearings in early August before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Joseph Biden, the chairman, says that war is a certainty. It's just a question of when and how much will it cost, and will we go it alone? Then over the course of the end of August, you find an increasing promotion of the war. Cheney, Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, even Colin Powell all appear on the Sunday morning talk shows. And we're still not having any debate. I mean, what we're having is a sham debate between different factions of the administration. Powell's briefing paper against Paul Wolfowitz's briefing paper, or Scowcroft's opinion somehow nuanced against Henry Kissinger's opinion. But there's no real argument as to why we're doing this, or what we intend after the Baghdad has been reduced to rubble, or how dangerous really is Saddam Hussein, and if he is dangerous to whom, and so forth. But then comes the speech at the UN on September 12th, where Bush makes the full court press, threatens, runs through the resolutions. There is no new evidence of that speech. In that speech, none that I can see. I mean, what he simply says is that Saddam Hussein has defied 16 Security Council resolutions. Israel has defied 38 Security Council resolutions. So what? That's evidence of nothing, as far as I can see. And then he goes on to threaten the United Nations itself. Unless you do what you are told to do, you are irrelevant. And we will do whatever we choose to do. And now this is in defiance of Bush is defiant here of the whole principle of international law, also of the UN Charter. You could write the headline if you had an aggressive press. Somebody could write a headline that says, "Madman threatens UN." But our media obviously didn't get that far, but they didn't even question the speech. They were interested, as our media tends to be, in pose or gesture. Did the president look presidential? Those were the kind of commentaries. I mean, was there enough gravitas? Is this a man who can wear the toga of the young Augustus? Will he be taken seriously by Jacques Chirac? And no question, after the speech, the press deliberately refrained from pursuing the text with further questions, because, as one of the journalists explained later that night on Nightline, they didn't want to spoil the effect. The speech was so good, so presidential, so weighty, that we didn't want to contradict it. Now, I haven't heard the debate today in Washington, but I don't think there's going to be much objection from the Democratic Congress. The Democrats seem to be intimidated by the thought that they might be seen as unpatriotic prior to the November elections. And they've been remarkably quiet over the entire summer. What criticism, serious criticism or serious objection to the Bush invasion plan has been advanced by Republicans, by House Majority Leader Dick Armey, or by the Senator Hager from Oklahoma. And then it comes and I ask myself, why dissent missing. I mean, where is the argument? And then it occurs to me that dissent is never easy or popular, particularly in the United States. Tom Paine was denied burial in consecrated ground in the United States because the attitudes that he was espousing later in his life were considered outrageous and scandalous by among others, John Adams. Paine, if you remember, wrote the founding document of the revolution, Common Sense, and wrote many of the revolutionary pamphlets during the Revolutionary War. These are the times that try men's souls and so on, rallying the troops at Valley Forge and in winter quarters in New Jersey. After Paine was an idealist and a stirrer-up of questions. He wrote some of the very first pamphlets ever published in the United States, advancing the cause of women, asking why women did not have the same political rights as men. He also wrote, if not the first, the second attack on slavery in the United States, when he was a journalist in Philadelphia prior to the Revolutionary War. But there was no role for him after we won the Revolutionary War. We signed the Treaty of Paris, 1782-83, and the next thing that happens is Paine goes to England because he's not a politician. He's not in search of office or patronage. So, and he's continuing to ask awkward questions, and they are not as welcome in 1783 as they were in 1776, because the American politicians have now inherited their new estate. They're free from England. It's coming down to a matter of dividing up the spoils, and they really don't want to hear the kind of thing that Paine is likely to tell them. So Paine goes off to England and writes a book called Rights of Man, which is an attack on the British aristocracy. And in that pamphlet, he puts forward many of the ideas that it takes another 150 years to put into practice. He has notions of public education, he has notions of social security, he has notions of health insurance, he has fair labor laws. All these ideas are in embryo in that pamphlet, and he is declared an outlaw by the British government and forced to flee for his life, even though that book, like Common Sense, becomes an enormous bestseller. The Paine's Common Sense and Paine's Rights of Man are two of the, if not the two, best-selling books of the 18th century, and he is one of the 4 household names at the end of, say, the year 1785. Everybody in the Western civilized world, France, England, the United States, Italy, would have recognized 4 names. They would have been Joseph Priestley, the British scientist, Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Paine. I mean, the name had as much resonance as Mick Jagger. I mean, he was a star. So, having written The Rights of Man, he comes across the Channel as fleeing from his life, and he's received and welcomed in Calais as a hero, because Rights of Man becomes one of the founding documents of the French Revolution. And he's elected a member of the French Assembly from Calais, and together with Condorcet is on the committee that writes the new French Constitution. He then falls afoul of the terrorist development. The revolution, as you remember, starts in a moderate way and becomes terrorist under the direction of Robespierre in the second half, and Paine falls afoul of Robespierre, and he's sent to the Luxembourg prison. While he's in prison, he writes The Age of Reason, which is his attack on organized religion. And it is this book that gets him in trouble in the United States. That is why John Adams thinks of him as a libeler of all things sacred. Mark Twain runs across the same difficulty at the end of the 19th century when he is objecting to the Spanish-American War and to the subsequent American occupation of the Philippines, which was a brutal occupation, and I'm not sure how many Filipinos were killed, but it was a large number. And Twain writes bitter and satirical pieces casting doubt on the American military and foreign policy establishment of his day. And none of these pieces get printed because the editors in New York, I'm sorry to say among them the then editor of Harper's magazine, found the pieces, quote, unsuitable during a time of high patriotic feeling, and they weren't published until 1923, 13 years after Twain died. Tocqueville makes the same observation. I mean, he's traveling around America in 1830, and he is surprised to find that despite the boisterousness of the Americans, they are reluctant to exercise the privilege of free expression, which is granted to them by the Constitution, but that they prefer to defer to what Tocqueville calls the tyranny of the majority, not wishing to rock the boat. So maybe I'm expecting too much in the way of dissent in the current circumstances, because the other theme that runs through American foreign policy of the 20th century is the religious one. You have McKinley advancing the war, the Spanish-American War, on religious grounds. The United States will impart virtue to the savage race in the Philippine Islands. Roosevelt, when he seizes the Panama Canal, is doing it with the same kind of rhetoric that Bush uses. We are doing this for all civilization. We are not doing it for mere gain. It is our civilizing mission. Wilson, in 1913, wants to do some regime change in Mexico because the then president of Mexico is rebellious and tyrannical, and so we send the Marines to Veracruz to effect a regime change, and Wilson says, we will teach the Latin Americans to elect good men. I mean, we have the same, you hear the same language now coming out of Washington. We're going to teach the Iraqis how to set up a model democracy, and it doesn't work that way. Then Wilson goes to when we go into World War I, he comes out of that war with the 14 points, which again are high-minded, transcendental, moral notions. They're not specific policies and objectives. George Clemenceau, who was the French Prime Minister at the treaty, at the Conference of Versailles, on reading the 14 points for the first time, looked up, and after he read them, he said, "God only wrote 10." We hired, as a curiosity, we hired Wilson's propaganda minister was a man named the Karl Rove of the Wilson administration was a man named George Creel. And the question in 1917, when we declare war, and when we joined the war in Europe, you still had the problem of selling the reason to the American people. Why are we going abroad in search of monsters to destroy? And Creel came up with the notion of the canon of great books, the canon that has been, the subject of considerable debate during the culture wars of the last 20-odd years, where it's presented as some form of holy text, was in fact an act of propaganda. It was, the object was to turn American militaries, the soldiers in Europe, into what Creel called, quote, thinking bayonets, close quote. And in order to make sure that they were thinking the right thoughts as they went into the Argonne Forest, we came up with the notion, Creel came up with the notion of the canon of the summary of great Western civilization, which was then presented to the historian Charles Beard at Columbia University, and Beard was told that he had to teach this, or that, not Beard, but Beard was among the professors, as was Thorsten Veblen. And Columbia imposed this curriculum on its students, and both Beard and Veblen resigned. They weren't having any of that and went off and started the new school. So there is this religious theme. I mean, we have to be able to sell our foreign adventures as a crusade. And Bush has been doing that. If you read the language of the evildoers and even the speech that he made 2 weeks ago in front of, standing in front of the Statue of Liberty, ends up with the Gospel according to St. John, and it is a constant theme, as it was a constant theme in his father's speeches. His father was sending the troops to Somalia. The speech that he made on the lawn of the White House was, our troops are going there to do God's work. Jimmy Carter, before he sent the helicopters to try to rescue the American hostages in Tehran, later said in his memoirs that the night before sending the helicopters, he got down on his knees in the White House and asked God whether it was okay to send the helicopters, and God said it was, and so the helicopters. God, however, did not say that they would land safely, but there is this strain in the American, certainly politics. You could not run for office, I don't think, in political office in this country, and without professing your faith in God. This book came out last 2 weeks ago in Paris. It had already been translated into French. And so I was in Paris talking to reporters journalists from Le Monde and the Nouvelle Observateur and so on, trying to explain this religious theme to him. It's something that the Europeans never seem to understand about the United States. And I, of course, am a secular person and distrust the messianic spirit wherever it shows up. I mean, I'm just as distrustful of it in a politician as I would be of it in a school headmaster, or I'm distrustful of it whether it's Islamic or whether it's Christian. And I think Bush is a true believer. He's a guy who, as you know, is twice born. I think he declared, he made, I was governor of Texas. He declared that June 10th become a state holiday known as Jesus Day and must be celebrated. And I don't know what the significance of June 10th is in the life of Jesus, but anyway, that is Jesus Day in Texas. And you have the same kind of head in John Ashcroft, who is our Attorney General, who has said on a number of occasions, Bob Jones University, while making speeches in North Carolina, that in the United States there is no king but Jesus. That is a direct quote. And he has also explained to various conferences of evangelical preachers that the Constitution was not written by men, but that was actually given to the founding fathers by God, as in the same way that the tablets were given to Moses on the mountain. And the Attorney General begins every morning with a prayer meeting. His immediate associates and staff stand around in his office at 8 o'clock in the morning, hold hands, consider the meaning of a passage in the Bible, and then sing songs, some of them the Attorney General's own composition. And they're hymns to the power of the American state. So I think that in Ashcroft and in Bush you have the true believer and the messianic spirit. I think that in Cheney and in Rumsfeld you have people who are extremely cynical and who are also, at least in my opinion, contemptuous of the American Republic. In other words, it's not only the line about the evidence being absent, but it is the refusal to open, let's say, the energy policy meetings, to say to the Congress, this is none of your business. We are not obliged to share any of our secrets with you because you are a lesser breed, essentially, is what they're saying. Or you have Rumsfeld again. 3 weeks ago, his aide, Paul Wolfowitz, was about to appear at a press conference at the Brookings Institution in Washington, and he was asking Rumsfeld how he should present himself to the press. How should he how to deal with the media was the question, and Rumsfeld said, well, it's very simple how you deal with the media. You begin with an illogical premise, and then you proceed perfectly logically to an illogical conclusion. And in other words, you tell them whatever they want, whatever you want to tell them. And that is the way our media by and large, the large media accepts that. The Pentagon learned one lesson in Vietnam, which was not to let the cameras get too close to the action because the pictures subsequent pictures could be disturbing. So we really don't know what's going on in Afghanistan. We see very little footage. Very few reporters are close to knowing what's going on in Afghanistan. There's more information in the British press and in the French press than there is in our own. And the ABC television cameras certainly are not, news cameras are not permitted except under certain quarantines imposed by the Pentagon. And yet, at the same time, Disney, which owns ABC, has made a deal with the Pentagon and a movie producer named Jerry Bruckheimer, who is a producer of Top Gun and also of Black Hawk Down. So Bruckheimer has been hired by Disney and the Pentagon to make an 18-part series called The War in Afghanistan. And that will be our news. It will be a movie. So, having said, again, with this context in mind, you go back to September 11th, and from the point of view of the Bush administration and the military foreign policy establishment in Washington, it's possible to see the attack on the trade tower as a blessing in disguise, or as the silver lining in a cloud, because think what purposes it has been put to in the last year. In August of 2001, Bush was generally being perceived as a failed president. He had, his popularity was falling rapidly. The Republicans had lost control of the Senate. The economy was beginning to deteriorate. The only legislative accomplishment that could be chalked up to the Bush administration was a tax cut for the wealthiest people in the country. Compassionate conservatism wasn't being seen as very compassionate, and people were making jokes about Bush's inarticulateness and difficulties with the language. Stanford University actually did a study. When I saw a report of it within the last 3 weeks, in which they apply one of their Stanford standard literacy tests, in which they try to establish grade levels, reading grade levels. The Bush State of the Union address came in at the 6th grade level. Clinton, 4 years ago, was at the 8th grade level. And I think 20-odd years ago, they were still at the 12th grade level. But all of a sudden, Bush, who's, as I say, has some trouble with the language, is within a week of September 11th is being seen by the Washington Post as Churchillian, and by the New York Times as Lincolnesque. I can understand, but it also seems to have given Bush a role that he knows how to play. I don't think he knew how to play the role of the President of the United States, because I think it was too complicated and there were too many moving parts in it. But I think he does know how to play the Commander-in-Chief, with us or against us. It also, of course, was a great boon to the military budget. We have in the current issue of Harper's Magazine an interesting, what I find to be anyway, an interesting analysis of 3 Defense Department policy planning papers written in 1991 and 1992 by Cheney and Powell, the then Secretary of Defense and the then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying, now that the Gulf War is over and the Cold War is over, how do we find an enemy that will allow us not to pay the peace dividend and to continue to build up the military-industrial complex? And they go through this, and it says it in just so many words. I mean, we need an enemy. We will, for the time being, leave the name blank. But it's a name we have to come up with. And so they're already thinking this way in 10 years ago. And then again, you add Rumsfeld's remark last fall where he says the war on terrorism will last for 35 years. So I think that we've come to a real crossroads. I mean, I have found myself suddenly making, last night, or 2 nights ago, I gave this kind of talk in San Francisco and found there were 1,100 people in the audience, and genuinely concerned as to, not only about the forthcoming invasion of Iraq, but as to what is the nature of the American idea. And I think that this is a time when it is truly, I think that it's an open question. So with that, I will open the floor to questions. Okay.